All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, AI and Higher Education, What You Need to Know, presented by Saul Ewing. Today, my colleagues and I will discuss the many implications of employing artificial intelligence technology at academic institutions. As many of you know, colleges and universities are increasingly integrating AI into various aspects of their operations, which in turn are raising critical legal, compliance, and ethical concerns. With AI's growing adoption within higher education institutions, college and university professionals must have a better understanding of AI so that they can adeptly advise on the use of this technology as questions and concerns inevitably surface. My name is Matt Cole. I'm a partner in the Saul Ewing's litigation group. I also oversee the firm's AI working group and keep my colleagues up to date on the ever-changing AI landscape. And today I'm pleased to be joined by two of my colleagues, Sandy Bilas, partner in the firm's higher education group and a co-chair of the firm's cybersecurity and data privacy practice, and Brandon Sherman, who is counsel in our higher education group. Before we begin, I need to go through a few housekeeping announcements. So questions, I'm sure you'll have some during the conversation today. We look forward to taking them. It makes it interactive, which we really enjoy. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. While we'll do our best to answer all questions submitted during the webinar, if we run out of time, we will follow up individually via email. Also, today's program has been approved for 1 distance learning CLE credit in California, Delaware, Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island, with applications pending in Minnesota and Virginia. As a CLE provider, you must be able to verify your attendance. Therefore, at random points during this webinar, you will display and verbally announce 2 numeric reporting codes that you must record and report back to us using the CLE survey that you receive in your webinar reminder email and will open automatically in your browser at the completion of the program. We will in turn send your certificate of attendance once you receive your survey response. Please be sure to respond to the Saul Ewing CLE survey with your numeric codes within 5 days of this program. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that will include links to the recording, supplemental presentation materials, and CLE information. And last, the provision and receipt of the information in this program is not legal advice, does not create a lawyer-client relationship, and should not be acted on without seeking professional counsel who have been informed of the specific facts. And with all that being said, let's begin. So next slide, please. So Sandy, why don't you set the stage for us?
All right, thanks, Matt, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Sandy Bilas, as Matt mentioned. It is my role in today's webinar to deliver the ethical spinach that you all are here to eat, because we're giving you some ethics credit along with all the other stuff that you're learning today. So I'll be popping in throughout the presentation to comment on how what we're talking about can implicate your own professional conduct responsibilities as lawyers for your institutions. So on the screen right now are 4 categories of rules that I've set out that we are going to be talking about throughout the program today that come up as you use AI and as your institutions use AI. So I just wanted to set them out at the outset so that you have an understanding of the ethical background that we're working against. So the first box there is competence. Rule 1.1 says that a lawyer shall provide competent representation to a client. Competent representation requires the legal knowledge, skill, thoroughness, and preparation reasonably necessary for the representation. As you'll hear later, it also includes staying abreast of technological changes in the law and in what technologies are available for you to use when providing legal services. The second category is confidentiality. Rule 1.6 says that you shall not, as a lawyer, reveal information relating to the representation of a client unless the client gives informed consent, or the disclosure is impliedly authorized to carry out the representation, or there's certain other rule-allowed disclosures. And you're supposed to make reasonable efforts to prevent the inadvertent or unauthorized disclosure of or unauthorized access to information relating to the representation of a client. This is broader than what attorney-client privilege covers, right? That's just communications between an attorney and client for the purposes of obtaining or providing legal advice. This is anything that you learn about a client in the course of representing that client. And you'll see this comes up when using AI tools, because some AI tools don't keep that information confidential. So you have to be careful there. The third category is truthfulness, both truthfulness to third parties as well as to courts. So you are not supposed to bring or defend a proceeding or assert or controvert an issue therein unless there's a basis in law or fact for doing so that is not frivolous. You cannot make a false statement of material fact or law to a third person, and you cannot fail to disclose a material fact to a third person when disclosure is necessary to avoid assisting a criminal or fraudulent act by a client. And it is professional misconduct for a lawyer to engage in conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. That's 8.4. So this comes up because AI tools can hallucinate and give you incorrect information. And if you go out and use that information out in the world, you may be committing fraud or providing some untruthful information to third parties. And then the final box there is supervision. And while you may think of, okay, I've got some paralegals or other legal professionals in my office that I supervise, you might also want to think about your duties to supervise non-lawyers, including an AI tool may be considered a non-lawyer that is providing you with assistance if you're using it in providing legal services to your clients. So we'll talk about that as well as we go. We can move on to the next slide.
All right. So let's delve a little bit into artificial intelligence, what it is, and some of the relevant terminology that has been making some headlines, and just give a little more details into what we're talking about today. So really, there is no accepted definition of artificial intelligence. I seem to find a lot of ways. I like to think of it just as a form of intelligence that replicates human reasoning, right? So at its base, AI is a software system, and artificial intelligence is a software system that can replicate human reasoning and do certain things that are unique to humans. Make recommendations, identify patterns and signals, draw conclusions, things of that nature. Machine learning is a subset of AI in which something like an algorithm or a rule that is designed to solve a certain problem can be generated by the AI tool itself without explicit human instructions. So everybody has been focused for the last 9 months to a year on ChatGPT, right? ChatGPT is a machine learning tool, and the key concept in machine learning is that it doesn't need explicit human instructions and whether to develop further rules, refine its algorithms, or develop things like statistical models. Generative AI, I think everybody at this point knows what Gen AI is, right? It's a type of AI that creates content based on prompts that users put into it. The output, or what is generated, is called output. And Gen AI can be used to create content in a variety of different media, written text, videos, software code, audio files, movies, et cetera, et cetera. GPT, that is the GPT in ChatGPT, and what that stands for is Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Generative refers to the idea of content creation or generative AI. Pre-trained refers to the fact that these models, these LLMs, are trained on a voluminous amount of data, right? So for instance, LLMs like ChatGPT and some of the more publicly accessible models might scrape every website off the internet. That includes social media pages, user feeds, things like Reddit, right? Or things that are specifically fed into the models to train them for a specific purpose. So it's just the idea of providing large volumes of data so that the AI system can provide an output in response to a user's prompt. And transformer is really just a concept of user prompt in, output out. And so ChatGPT and a lot of the other technologies that people are using today mostly are LLMs. And an LLM is a language model, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute, but it's based on a quote-unquote neural network that sort of replicates the way neurons in the human brain are supposed to think about language and provides responses along those lines. Natural language processing and understanding are two terms. That's really a way for the AI system to sort of comprehend language, right? It's a linguistic tool, a linguistic subset of AI. And you can really think about it in two ways. I think about it as natural language processing is sort of teaching the AI system human language in a very formalistic way, what words mean, how sentences are structured, so that way it can provide the next best word in a sequence when providing a response to an individual. But of course, humans, right, don't speak necessarily or write in a very formalistic way all the time. We use context, we use similes and metaphors. And so the idea of natural language understanding is to teach the tool to respond when humans provide that context, right? Or use similes and or not acting so formally. So if I were to say, hey, AI, Alexa, it's hot in here, right? Do I need to crack the window? If it had just a very linguistic, formalistic approach, it wouldn't be able to give me a proper response. So adding that context, that natural language understanding is an efficient way of allowing the tool to sort of communicate with us and give us the response that it thinks it wants us to have. And then hallucination, as Sandy mentioned, is a sort of a false or made up bit of information that's provided by the AI system. And so there's a few reasons why hallucinations result. It can result from bad training data, right? So there's an expression you may have heard called garbage in, garbage out. So if an AI system is just scraping everything on the internet and a lot of sort of junky data, that might lead to hallucinations. Hallucinations might result from poorly written prompts drafted by the user. It may also result from AI tool not being the right tool for the job, right? So you may work at an institution and want to draft a contract or create some kind of document that is specific to one industry and was trained on terms, say, in the healthcare industry, but you're asking it to generate output that might be relevant to another industry, say the financial industry, and it's going to not tell you it doesn't understand something or have an appropriate response. It's going to make things up. And it may result in hallucinations, right? And so not having the best data for the job, having poor data quality, and also having poorly written prompts are all things that can result in hallucinations. Next slide, please. And so what is an LLM, right? An LLM is a probabilistic model of language. And so really the key takeaways here is that you use LLMs on the internet like ChatGPT and other products and Copilot, right? It doesn't know anything. It doesn't like a person does. It doesn't understand anything like a person does. Right? It's a very eloquent writer. It can give you very nice notes and output, but it doesn't mean it really knows anything. It's just really good at predicting the next word in a sequence, right? The key point is that it's optimized for fluency, not accuracy. So when using an LLM, you have to understand that there's a risk that you're going to have hallucinations, that you have to craft prompts in a very smart way to provide the context and almost talk to it like it's a first-year associate to give it the background or describe what it is you want it to do to mitigate the risks of hallucinations, but also to increase the likelihood that it's going to give you a good output because of the way it's sort of trained and the way the algorithms are applied to the data. And so for all those paying attention, the first CLE code is 53219. All right, next slide, please.
All right, I'm back with some more ethical news. Here's the first ethical issue that I wanted everybody to think about as they approach using generative AI tools in their legal practice on behalf of their institutions. And also it comes up when reviewing other ways that the institution may want to use AI and they come to you and ask you for help in thinking it through. So that's rule 1.1 again. I mentioned at the outset, the competence rule. You have to provide competent representation to a client, and that requires the legal knowledge, skill, thoroughness, and preparation that is reasonably necessary for the representation. And critically, in the comments to the rule, to maintain the requisite knowledge and skill, you are supposed to keep abreast of changes in the law and its practice, including the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. Here we go. We are keeping abreast with those technological developments simply by sitting here and listening to me talk. So what are the competency dangers that arise when using generative AI or thinking about helping others use it? You may not understand what it's doing, right? Or what you're doing with it. And so when you want to use one of these tools or you're talking with a colleague who's using these tools, think through, do I really understand to a reasonable degree how this works, what the limitations are on it? Are there terms of use out there that we're signing up for that limit our use or that talk about what it's going to do with the data that we give to it? Also think about, Matt and I, we've already mentioned the word hallucination a number of times, but how are you going to go about verifying that what the tool is providing you as far as output goes is correct, right? Are you going to actually, rely on the tool itself? There's a well-known story at this point about a lawyer who submitted a brief to a court that contained fake cases that generative AI made up. And when the court told him to verify that these cases were real, he went back to the ChatGPT tool and said, "Are these cases real?" And it said, "Yes," even though it's lying, it's making them up, right? So how are you going to verify that what the tool is telling you is correct? And also think about, am I using my own professional judgment as a lawyer and everything I know, or am I just relying on the tool's judgment for making decisions and providing advice to the client? So when you are thinking through all of these questions, just remember, anything that the AI tool puts out, you have to carefully review it for accuracy. And as we'll talk about more, also for biases that can come out in the output. I think we can go on to the next slide.
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the higher education community in AI. A lot of the discussion about AI and higher education is focused on colleges, on how it's being used in the classroom, and to a lesser extent with research. But colleges that are adopting AI, it's not limited to kind of the large research institutions, but it's institutions of all sectors within higher ed, maybe career colleges that are focused on preparing students for careers in AI. And then colleges are not the only entities within the higher education community using AI. It's, accreditors. It can be part of their evaluation process, part of their decision-making process, and perhaps eventually they're going to need to develop standards around AI. The ed tech world, they're developing a lot of these AI products. Marketing firms, which surprisingly are maybe the most involved in using AI in higher education, as they're using AI products to help target and communicate with prospective students, create ad copies, and we'll go into those a little bit more later. And within we're talking about marketing firms, which, depending on how the Department of Education interprets what a third-party servicer is, they may be held to additional standards, but the Department of Ed certainly, under the current rules, there are a lot of entities that are kind of touching Title IV information that are also using AI products. And let's not forget about the Department of Education. Students and borrowers can go on FSA's website, and now there's a handy, useful bot that will answer questions on financial aid and how do you prepare your FAFSA, and what are the collection and payment options for students. And you see there's still many within the community that are reluctant for a number of reasons to utilize AI products. But for those that are interested in using AI, I think it's, AI, there's not right now a lot of barriers of entry. We're not, for a college adopting AI, let's say, products or integrating into the classroom. It doesn't require substantive change or regulatory approval. But who knows, perhaps this will shift in the future. Next slides. So marketing, very big. I went to a conference last week, and there were a number of vendors that are using AI to assist institutions in their recruiting and marketing efforts. And some of them are doing is they're using AI to create copy as they're using as part of their lead generation functions. They are, again, another entity using chatbots, and a lot of these materials, the AI function is maybe taking the lead, but humans will review the copy before it all goes out. But certainly this is a growing area for marketing, the marketing world within higher ed. Admissions, AI can be used to, gather and analyze enrollment data, to interact with students that have questions about admissions, and to screen applicants as well. Institutions may get thousands of applicants, and to go through each one, may not be possible, or AI may actually provide a more thorough review. Financial aid, of course, you've heard about some of the problems with the FAFSA and the U.S. Department of Education. So AI has a very useful tool to provide students with maybe some information on, what scholarships they're going to be are available, what are the next steps, and with repayment options, it's certainly been helpful there. Research, academics, professors are using AI. They're using AI as a research tool. They're also researching what AI may look like in the future, what are the capabilities and risks, and also as an opportunity to collaborate with other researchers outside their campus. Learning, use a number of ways, from content creation to as a tool for students, really almost as a tutor. It's additional learning resources. It's quite valuable there. Next slide. Assessment, assessing students' progress, not just within that course, but as they progress, or hopefully progress through the academic program. Also allows institutions to assess these student outcomes and ways that they may need to improve their curriculum or instruction. Online proctoring, this was certainly big during COVID, but this allows this allows an institution to ensure that the student that's taking the exam is actually the one that is supposed to be taking the exam. It's the individual that is in the course, and again, you see this not just in the classroom, but also in the bar exam. HR, AI has been used on campuses to write job descriptions, among other functions. Administrative support, it's been certainly a valuable tool in back office operations. Accreditation, part of the peer review process, a way to digest, volumes of information, volumes of data. Sometimes it's being used as part of the decision-making process. It's certainly being used by some evaluators during on-site visits. Now, there's some discussion on the appropriate role of AI in accreditation, but it is being used by some right now. Next slide, please. Now, with all these great potential and tools that AI is providing institutions, there are, of course, some significant compliance risks. Start data privacy and cybersecurity. You have tremendous amounts of student data, education records, to student financial information. So when we're talking about financial aid, there could be bank account information, social security numbers, certainly data that's certainly at risk, very valuable to bad actors, and it needs to be protected. So this information is being, as AI is involved, there are some new risks, and those risks certainly have to be accounted for by institutions or whatever entity is utilizing those tools. Accessibility. Students or individuals that have, hearing impediments, visual impairments, even speaking impairments, that has to be accounted for. So, there may be an individual that is unable to, use a keyboard, and that may create some problems and will require some accommodations when there is a bot on the screen. Title VI, Title IX, so discrimination. As we're talking about biases, certain, the proctoring devices, for example, there are some that their algorithms tend to, suggest that certain traits are identified with certain categories of individuals, and based on those, based on that algorithm, that may trigger, for example, it might flag, cheating, suspicion of cheating, or other other elements, or other events that may lead to negative consequences for that student. Distance education, there's some question now of, as AI is being used in the classroom. Does that, how does that meet with the regular and substantive interaction requirements? Is AI, is that going to be considered an interaction? We don't know yet. That's still being considered, and of course, as AI evolves, there certainly will be other factors involved in the distance education and accreditor and education requirements. So third-party service reliability, of course. Institutions are jointly and severally liable for any non-compliance by a third-party servicer. So, if a servicer is using the data but unfortunately not protecting it, school is going to be liable, and that's certainly going to create some concerns for attorneys representing institutions. Next slide, please. There are obviously a lot of great tools, and there are a lot of compliance concerns, and kind of, as I reviewed, some of their most recent research and the way that AI is being used on campus, it became clear that AI can be part of your compliance program. We look at the prohibition on misrepresentation. As if AI as a tool to interact with students to when they're asking for information on a program, on outcomes. AI, it may be a way where, the up-to-date data is being provided to the students. We know it's being provided to the students. Unfortunately, in admissions offices, there's a lot of turnover. So they may not be as familiar with, the data, the student outcomes, licensure information, and other information that prospective students are rely on as they make their decisions. And as they rely, if students are relying on a misrepresentation, of course that could trigger bar defense claims and violations of your PPA and other compliance standards. Standards with student outcomes. As we went back, we're talking about assessments on student progress, and AI has the capability of kind of alerting the institution when there's a student that is at jeopardy for not completing their program. Well, this provides an opportunity, almost a warning to the institution that, the institution wants to keep up and continue to meet their student outcome standards. So this allows, kind of an early warning and provides the school with perhaps some notice. So just real quickly, the last slide. Next slide, please. And just real quickly, responses by regulators right now. Most of the regulators, Department of Ed, Congress, they see the potential in the classroom and in learning, but they also see the risks, especially when it comes to discrimination, accessibility. So there's a lot of, to be determined in those areas. Accreditors, a lot of them now are seeking information and putting out some guidance on how this can be involved later on. So next, so I'll turn it over to Matt.
Actually, it's me again. Surprise, with more ethics. So I mentioned this duty of confidentiality earlier. Don't reveal information relating to the representation of your client, except in certain circumstances. So when you're using generative AI tools, there is a danger here that when you upload information into the tool, and ask it to generate something, the tool may take that information that you've given it and use it for training to create future responses to other people, or otherwise share that information with third parties. That is a real danger. You could be breaching your duty of confidentiality. You could also be just letting out information out into the world that you wouldn't want out there, whether there was a duty of confidentiality in the professional rules of conduct or not. When you are going to be using a tool, or when you're helping a colleague at your institution think about onboarding a tool, ask, does this tool have adequate confidentiality and security protections? And if you don't have the requisite knowledge to be able to assess whether the security measures that are in place are adequate, bring in your school's information security team or an outside expert to assess the tool. Also, have they agreed in writing not to use what you input into the tool for training purposes or to otherwise share the information? And beware, I ran into a situation not that long ago where I was speaking with the salespeople who were speaking on behalf of their company, trying to get us to onboard a generative AI tool. And they were saying, oh, absolutely not. We would never use your information to train our tool. And then I took a look at the agreement that they were offering us, the terms of use, and it was the opposite. It was absolutely written so that they could use what we input into the tool to train the tool. So don't always believe what the salespeople tell you. So I would also add, once you look through the security measures that are in place, do they have an obligation to notify you if there's a breach? Are they going to delete your information once your school's contract with the company is terminated? Have they agreed in writing not to use it for training? Even with all of those protections in place, you can always minimize what you put into the tool, right? Anonymize it. Don't use your institution's name. Don't use the names of students or employees or professors. Try to keep it anonymized so that even if somehow the information that you put in there gets out into the world, it cannot be used to identify your client. We can go on to the next slide.
All right, so I'll take you over from here. So to Sandy's point, thinking about confidentiality, you really have to look at the AI tools that people are using in two large categories, right? You have the publicly accessible websites like ChatGPT and things of that nature. And you have to start with the assumption that anything you put in there is not confidential, right? The terms of use are very clear. They do not guarantee confidentiality of the inputs and the prompts. And you have to understand that people are going to see it, and what you put in a prompt may end up in somebody's output. Now, the other type of tool could largely be thought of as an enterprise software tool that you may license from a third-party software provider. And Sandy gave a great caution about dealing with salespeople, right? They are trying to get a contract signed. In my experience, having negotiated AI contracts, they don't always understand the terms of the contract. They certainly don't always understand the technology. And one of the main risks is trying to get an understanding of the tool you're trying to onboard and utilize within your institution. So it's really important, and we'll talk about this in a moment, to do due diligence on the tool, the confidentiality issues, and some of the points Sandy raised about how training data, how the data is going to be used, who's going to get access to it, what remains your information, and what can be shared with third parties. So some of the key questions when trying to understand, is this the right tool for me? Is this the right tool for our people? Is the use case fit the culture and needs of our organization? Are things like, what are the anticipated inputs? Are we going to be putting in PHI, PII, sensitive information, potentially information that might even give your organization a competitive advantage? What are some of the outputs, right? Is it high risk type information that you may want your employees to only keep and be used internally and not want shared externally with third parties in a marketing piece, for instance? Or is it something low risk, right? Is it simply allowing people to draft emails or do some kind of research that doesn't involve sensitive information? The next question is, who owns and controls the various data sets? Sandy brought up training data, right? So you have to look very carefully at the contract. And I will say this, there really is no standard form of AI license agreement at this point. Everything is subject to negotiation And there is a lot of ability now to push back. I feel like last summer when AI was getting very popular, everyone was in a rush to onboard an AI tool because they could say, hey, we got the greatest, newest toy on the block. We've now onboarded this tool. There's a lot of pressure from salespeople to do so. I think now things have slowed down a little bit, and you can take your time and very carefully vet the technology and the terms and conditions in the contract. So you want to make sure, right now it's becoming almost standard that the AI tool will not be trained on your company's, your organization's sensitive data, the information that's put into a prompt, and what LLM is being leveraged, right? So oftentimes, companies talk about, well, they've developed their own LLM. Most of the time, that's not true. They're licensing, right, an LLM from OpenAI or another third-party service provider because it's very expensive and time-consuming, tens of millions of dollars to develop an LLM. So you want to understand the technology, the underlying training data sets. For instance, I mentioned garbage in, garbage out, right? Is it every website, everything scraped off the internet that could open you up to copyright infringement concerns, or is it a finite, closed universe of data that might be specific for a particular use? And is the data, has it been cleaned? Has it been enhanced? Has there been any sort of modification to make it, a better fit for your organization and to mitigate the risk of hallucinations? And so in thinking about AI, right, there are certain things you can do. You can ask the vendor for something called a model card, right, which lays out some of this information. It tells you what version of the system you're using, the purpose for which it's designed. It might provide information on the kind of data that has been used in the training sets. And so my general takeaway is if the vendor, the third-party service provider, the AI company is not willing to provide information to you, run in the other direction, because there are now enough vendors in the marketplace where you can be choosy and you can have that conversation with the vendor. Is it the pressure sort of is off, and so you have to do a lot of diligence, but in the end, it's a good risk management exercise, and you actually learn a lot about the technology, which is important before deploying it within your organization. So here are some of the primary risk areas when using AI tools through vendors, the enterprise system, right? IP infringement, I mentioned this, right? So tools like OpenAI, I'm sure you've seen all these lawsuits, right? All they do is scrape everything off the internet. And so that includes copyrighted works, right? Articles, New York Times news stories, books, images. So you have to understand, is it everything that's out there? Is it junky data, right? Is it good data? Who owns the input and the output? That is often addressed in a contract. Most of the time, it's become pretty standard now that the user owns the input and the user owns the output. But of course, right, does that output contain somebody else's copyrighted information? That thought should always be sort of in the back of your mind. Confidentiality, as Sandy mentioned, right? The publicly accessible websites don't provide any confidentiality whatsoever. And so when you're taking on an enterprise system, you want to very carefully make sure that the data that you're putting into a prompt, your organization's data, the PII of your students, your employees, your alumni, your volunteers, et cetera, all of that will be maintained as confidential, and that the system that's you're onboarding will sort of comply with privacy statutes and give you a guarantee of confidentiality. Data security sort of goes hand in hand with that, right? You want to make sure that the AI tool has, cybersecurity protections in place. Of course, you have to consider hallucinations and make sure that that's the right tool for the job. And that's why you have to ask these questions of the vendor. What is your training sets? What data is your system trained on? Is it the right data set? Is it a completely unrelated industry? Is it good data? Is it everything? Is it a very finite system where we can understand, what's in there? And of course, you want to understand, is there an implicit bias in the training data and the AI model? And the answer to that question is yes, right? There's always going to be some bias in the training data, the model, the algorithms, because the algorithms are created by people, right? Software code and rules written by humans. So their bias is going to be naturally sort of, make its way into the algorithms. The training data, unless it's just scraped off every website on the internet, they're selected, right? The data sets are selected by people. So the biases of the software coders, the generators, that's going to find its way into the AI system. So there's some techniques that you can do, when you're asking the service provider, what have you done to validate the statistical, output of your machine to make sure that you've mitigated hallucinations? What have you done to mitigate the risk of bias and discriminatory output? And those are the kinds of questions that you're going to have to start thinking about asking when you're talking to your procurement people to make sure that the tool you're looking at is the right one for the job. Next slide, please. And so here's some more fine points on AI contracting considerations. We've talked about some of these already, but there really is no standard form of contract. The agreements vary, they vary significantly, and they have to be reviewed very carefully. Confidentiality is a big concern, right? Training data, how is it being used? And what are you giving away to the AI provider when you plug in that information into a prompt? Are you giving them a license to use your data? Are you giving them access and the ability to share it with third parties? You want to make sure you lock up all those provisions in your contract and maintain as tight of a control on you as you can on your data, because the more places where your data exists, the more liability you're exposing yourself to. You want to have a rep and warranty in your agreement, in your AI service contract, that the AI technology does not violate data privacy laws or the rights of third parties. When you're negotiating hard for these kinds of provisions, you want to get reps and warranties in the contract from the AI service providers. Similarly to the inputs, you want to address how the outputs are going to be used, right? Who owns them? I mentioned typically the company that the licensee owns the outputs, although that does not guarantee IP rights. As I mentioned, it may have someone else's copyrighted material in your output. Oftentimes contracts will have non-competes in a sense where you cannot build your own or buy and build your own AI system that competes with the technology that you are licensing. And then indemnity is a really important provision, right? Because AI tools are very risky, and you want to understand, well, okay, is the service provider going to have my back if something goes wrong? And there is a lot of room now to negotiate indemnity, especially in the copyright space. The only exception to that is when AI is used to intentionally infringe someone's intellectual property. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, vendor diligence is a really important exercise. It can take 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it is, but you really want to make sure you nail down all the questions that you have, and of course, are asking the right questions, right? I mean, some service providers, their tools aren't even really AI, right? But that's just a hot term. So you really want to drill down the technology, have them explain it to you. And if they can't explain to you how their tool works, not maybe in a very granular sense, but at least what AI techniques are being used, what the LLM is, how is this AI? Just give an overview of that. If they can't explain that to you, find another vendor, right? You want to lay out in your vendor questionnaire some of the points we've talked about: training data, data rights. Is your information being used to train their model to make it better? Data security, do they guarantee, right, that they have cybersecurity protections in place, that their AI tool is secure? Because at the end of the day, it's software, it can be hacked. Who's monitoring inputs and outputs? I've heard stories from in-house counsel at companies that have onboarded AI tools, and they've learned that, for instance, the AI tool they were using was actually monitoring not just their training data, the inputs, but also the internet web windows they had open. So you really want to address, right, what the power, what access the AI tool has to your system, to your information of your customers, of your employees, of your students, but also the research that you're doing on your computer. You really want to sort of drill it down, because once it's in LLM, there's no getting it out. You can't simply go in and delete it, right? So you want to understand what information the vendor is collecting, processing, and of course, sharing with third parties, right? Are they taking your PII, your employee information, putting it in their training data, and then sharing that when they license their product to a third party? What are their incident response procedures? Are they going to guarantee and stand behind their product to say, we will help, we'll cooperate? If there's a problem, something goes wrong, we will have clear lines of communication. We'll identify for you, who at the company to deal with, and here's how we recommend, responding to when there is an issue. Audit rights, right? Do you have the ability to go on site and see how third parties that might be using AI with your data, how they're doing that, what purposes they're using your PII for? And do you want to allow that? A lot of companies now that might have agreements with third parties that have access to their data are going back and amending agreements to say you can no longer use it for these purposes and limiting it. And of course, diligence responses, anything you learn or what's provided to you in a diligence questionnaire, you negotiate for that to be included in the reps and warranties into a contract, because if they're willing to advise you of this information in a questionnaire, they should be able to stand behind it in an agreement. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about bias. You have to sort of start from the angle that there's bias in the training data, right? Bias in the algorithms, bias in the tools developed and fine-tuned. So a lot of companies are onboarding LLMs and they are fine tuning it. What that means is they're taking a pre-existing LLM and they are tweaking it, essentially trying to improve it with their own data. Well, that can also lead to biases. For instance, there are those lawsuits against Amazon, right, where they had used an AI system in their employment process, and it was weeding out applicants who did not fit their existing pool of workers, right? Young white males, right, a certain age range. So that's how they fine-tune their AI system, based on their employees, based on their employee pools. And so you don't want to have an AI tool and inadvertently fine-tune it to lead to a discriminatory result. And of course, there's bias in the AI tools and output from third parties. Right, one of the vendor questionnaire issues you're going to address is, what mitigation techniques have you used to mitigate the risk of bias? What have you done? Is your system a closed system, or is it a dynamic system where when an input is put in, it modifies, it trains on it, and that could also lead to the risk of bias? You really want to nail down when you're onboarding an AI system what the vendor has done to mitigate the risk of bias, because as Brandon mentioned out, you are going to be held liable in the stream of commerce there. So your organization, when developing a policy for onboarding an AI tool, should adopt some guiding principles that address mitigation. Really have a well-defined bias mitigation strategy that looks at things like transparency and visibility, equity during AI development and deployment. You want to do these impact assessments, right? AI impact assessments are becoming very popular, becoming a must-do tool, sort of like a privacy assessment, understand who your stakeholders are, what the risks are, have that conversation and figure out how we can mitigate those risks. And then, of course, develop reporting guidelines when you do identify potentially a discriminatory result. And of course, if an AI system is being abused, right, being used for discriminatory purposes to harass students, colleagues, et cetera, you want to make sure that that's dealt with accordingly. Next slide, please. And just we'll touch on this a little bit. There are some IP considerations when using AI tools, right? Especially if you are a university that has a large research institution, you have to understand that innovations created with AI cannot be patented. That's become pretty clear now in the US and even in the UK. Earlier this year, the PTO issued guidance that says AI systems themselves cannot be inventors. And if a human is using AI in the creative process to generate some kind of invention, there must be some kind of significant contribution by that human. Similarly, copyright, right? Copyrightable works or AI that's used to create works of art, stories, images cannot be copyrighted. You have to demonstrate a significant human contribution there as well. So what that means has really not been litigated. It's going to be litigated. There have been a number of instances where the United States Copyright Office has rejected applications from artists who have sought to register comic books, paintings, pictures, etc., where AI was used in the process created, and not just those where it was exclusively AI in the creative process, but a human was sort of controlling the AI. So if you have students in an art class, right, you need to understand like their works are not copyrightable. If you're using marketing materials to advertise your university or institution using AI in the process, right, those may not be copyrighted and protected works. On the other side of that coin is, as I mentioned earlier, training data may often have other people's copyrighted materials in them. So if you're going to be using ChatGPT or other sort of accessible programs like Midjourney to create marketing materials or other things to sort of advertise your organization, you have to sort of understand there may be a risk of importing or including copyrighted information in those materials when you share them externally. And so when you are onboarding an AI tool, maybe you want to use one for marketing, you want to sort of understand what the training data is. So you say, get guarantees on indemnity, or understand that the AI provider made an effort to not include third parties' copyrighted materials in their training sets. And of course, that goes to the point of like human intervention, like Sandy mentioned, right? A lot of people use the phrase human in the loop. I think it's very important to have human eyes on everything, especially before it's shared externally, just to validate its accuracy and to check for these kinds of IP considerations. Next slide, please.
I'm back. This one's an easy one. Don't lie. And recognize that AI tools, like the ones we've been talking about, can cause you to lie if you go ahead and publish their output without taking steps to verify it. So, as a best practice, when you're using one of these tools, take those steps to verify it. Think about what that actually means. Do you need to look at the underlying primary sources that the tool is referring to? If it's citing to a case, go look at that case. If it's citing to a document, go look at that document. And prevent yourself from lying. You can go on to the next slide.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about when using an AI tool within your organization, right? I think a lot of companies have gotten out ahead of themselves and started allowing that without having a well-written and thoughtful process for doing it. And part of that process is the development of an AI policy. And when you're developing an AI policy, what that really is an exercise in risk management and risk identification. And to me, the biggest takeaway when developing an AI policy is to be proactive. And so, at this point, I would say all the surveys are showing that about 80% of organizations are allowing their employees to use AI, that about 80% of organizations' employees are finding substantial value in AI. So you have to get out in front of it, because if you don't, your employees are going to want to use it anyway because they find it to be a useful and helpful tool. And you don't want to be seen as sort of a stifler of innovation and creativity and sort of putting the kibosh on, allowing employees to do their job and freeing up their time to do some of the more mundane tasks through using AI to do some more of the higher level thinking type projects. And so when developing an AI policy, here are some of the considerations to think about, right? What are the applicable laws and regulations? Is it the right tool for the job? Of course, the laws and regulations cover privacy laws, HIPAA, FERPA, but of course, some of the IP considerations we've talked about. There needs to be an accountability framework in your AI policy. It needs to be enforced, and it has to be clear that non-compliance may result in disciplinary action, including suspension, expulsion, or termination for employees that intentionally misuse an AI tool. Next slide, please. So here are some of the fine points to think about in your risk management framework when developing an AI policy. We've talked a little bit about some of these already, right? The data that's being used to train the tool, what risk is there from all the data on the internet, right? Is it junky data? Is it someone else's copyrighted data? Is it your data that you're going to be using in an AI tool? Is it the data of some third parties? And how good is their data? What have they done to enhance it to make sure that there's no infringement risk or things of that nature, or that it doesn't violate privacy statutes? We've talked quite a bit about bias and discrimination. When developing an AI policy, one of the main questions to really ask is, not just what is the technology and how it works, but is it the right tool for the job? Why do we want to use it? How is it going to help, right, complement our organization's business? How is it going to enrich the lives of our employees, our students, et cetera? And who are the intended users? Is it going to be our employees, or is it going to be third parties that we're contracting with? Right? Are we allowing a third-party service provider to use AI with our data? We have to understand the risks of doing that, especially the privacy concerns. The method of access to the AI tool, depends how many, what kind of protections you want to have in place. For instance, is it a publicly accessible website, or do you want your employees to provide some kind of multi-factor authentication, some kind of security before they have access, so that you can track it, you can monitor it, you can develop objective metrics to how people within your organization are using AI, the reasons they're using it, the tools they're using, et cetera, et cetera. All of this is really looked at through the lens of governance, right? Which means having a robust team of subject matter experts to sort of check the AI technology, make sure it's the right tool for your organization, that the outcomes are right. And it doesn't have to necessarily be sort of an all or nothing approach, right? It can be a phased approach. You could demo programs, you could use them with certain departments or certain parts of your institution to make sure that employees like the tool, that the guarantees that the AI provider provides you in the contract are accurate and correct. And then you can roll it out to a larger audience and phase into your organization as you think it makes sense. And of course, human intervention, right? Monitoring it. A lot of organizations right now are sort of shy about allowing AI-generated output to be used externally to share with customers. You may, for instance, require that your employees check, as Sandy mentioned, your output for accuracy to make sure there's no bias in the output. And you can do certain things to make it clear that the output was generated by AI, like even just putting a footer, right, to advise others that this was AI-generated output and may contain misleading or false information. Next slide, please. And so we've talked about some of these already, right? Of course, be proactive, not reactive is one of my main takeaways on AI policy. You want to make sure you have all the right people at the table. When developing an AI policy for your organization, you want to have IT, HR, legal, and privacy. and set up sort of a robust AI steering committee or a task force and your AI policy should also govern when and how employees and students can use AI, right? Be very clear on what the permissible uses are and what the prohibited uses are, who can and cannot do certain things, right? There is no sort of one size fits all policy, right? The AI policy should be context specific. It should fit the needs and goals and culture of your institution. And of course, you want to have buy-in at the high level, at the highest levels, because the messaging that you give to employees is very important, that this is the right tool for the job, and you have to use it in a responsible fashion. Next slide, please. And here's some sort of other key takeaways on our AI policy. Of course, it should be clear and easy to understand. It should reflect your company's organization. And really, my main takeaways as we're running out of time are there's no one size fits all, but also, right, this is not set it and forget it. Right, AI policy should be revisited periodically to make sure the tool is working properly, it fits the use cases appropriately, and that you're sort of not dealing with some of the discriminatory output that we've talked about already. Next slide, please. And we've talked about this a little bit as well, so I'm just going to jump ahead to the next slide. But really, you want to understand what are the use cases, what is the technology, why are we using it, and is the tool fit our organization's culture of security, awareness, and respect for the rights of third parties. Next slide, please.
All right, last ethical slide. And before I even start, I'm going to give you CLE code number 2. It is 79321. 79321. So you have a duty to supervise the people that you work with properly. So if you supervise lawyers in your office, you have to make reasonable efforts to ensure that they conform to the rules of professional conduct. If you use a non-lawyer, I'll put that in quotes because some ethics guidance out there suggests that AI tools could be considered non-lawyers to help you do your work. You also have to make reasonable efforts to ensure that the non-lawyer's conduct is compatible with your professional obligations. You may be responsible for their violations of the rules. If you order the violation or with knowledge of the conduct that's going on, ratify that conduct or fail to take reasonable remedial action to avoid or mitigate the consequences of that conduct. So best practices to comply with your ethical duties here are some of the things that Matt has been talking all along. Have an AI policy regarding the permissible uses of generative AI. Train your team on how to use these tools ethically. Treat the AI tool like a non-lawyer assistant. Think about, is it what it's doing? Is it compatible with your professional obligations? Or are you basically relying on an inexperienced, overconfident assistant to do your work for you? And remember that you remain responsible for the work product that you create, even if you use an AI tool to help you do that. You can move on to the next slide.
Right, but here are just some key takeaways as we are wrapping up in the next couple of minutes. Some AI governance principles, right? Transparency. And that doesn't just necessarily mean with the company that is selling you or licensing to you the AI to understand, what the tool you're deploying within your organization, but also transparency with your stakeholders, right? Your students, your employees, about the AI tool, how it works, what tools use AI. There's a big focus recently in regulators in the consumer protection space for organizations and companies that are misleading the public about the use of AI services, that they are using it when they're not. Things of that nature is going to be a big focus of regulation going forward. The FTC is all over it. Data privacy and security. You really want to understand, right? How is our data being used? Who has access to it? Is it secure? Is the tool is the AI provider going to guarantee, right, certain things if something goes wrong? Safe and reliable solutions, right? We have to look again at I think that dovetails with fair and equitable use, right? Has the tool been validated statistically? What are the biases? What's the discriminatory output? And of course, it gets back to the training data, on asking these questions at the inception, doing your vendor diligence to understand as much as you can about the AI tool, how it was trained, and whose data is inside of it, right? Inclusiveness and accountability. I think the misuse of an AI technology can, of course, lead to severe consequences, and that should be laid out in your AI policy. You really want to think about sort of bias, right? That's also a big concern of regulators, right? Just last year, the EEOC has really been focusing on discriminatory outputs, and so an analogy here is that It's looking at resume scanners, so applicants are they being necessarily excluded due to some biased or defective AI technology and things of that nature. So you really have to drill down when taking on AI tools that are being used by your organization for talking to applicants, talking to the public, screening employees even. And we're at the top of the hour. Thank you everybody for attending. This concludes today's webinar. Chris just added the survey and codes to the chat box. Please also remember to keep an eye out for our follow-up email, which will include links to the program materials, recording, and CLE survey. Finally, if we did not get to your question, we will do our best to send you a response via email. In the meantime, please feel free to reach out to any of our presenters with questions. Thank you everybody for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.